Okay, so it is Thursday, February 26th, 2026. And if you've been glued to news notifications on your phone this week, feeling that very specific cocktail of confusion and maybe a little panic, you are definitely not alone.
No, you're really not. It's been a week.
It has. We're doing a deep dive today into a brand new and honestly absolute beast of a report. It's titled The Geostrategic and Socioeconomic Status of the United Kingdom by Fareed Novin from the Global Review.
And beast is the right word. I mean, this isn't just a policy paper you skim over your morning coffee. Novin is arguing that right now, literally this week, the UK is facing this, what he calls a convergence of fragility,
Right.
a situation we really haven't seen since the sterling crisis of 1976.
Yeah, that 1976 comparison is heavy. That's the whole IMF bailout era.
Yeah.
But what jumped out at me reading this wasn't just the doom-mongering. It was the specific framework Novin uses to analyze it. He talks about Bayesian game theory.
Yes.
Now, usually when I see the word Bayesian in a geopolitical report, my eyes kind of glaze over. But here, it's actually the only way to make sense of the chaos.
It really is, and it's crucial we understand it before we even get into the specific scandals. In a nutshell, Bayesian theory is about how you update the probability of an outcome based on new information.
Okay, break that down for us.
Sure. So you start with a belief. Say your baseline is the UK government is stable. Then a shock happens. That's new data. You don't just add that to the pile. You have to fundamentally recalculate your entire prediction of the future.
Right, it's like if you're betting on a horse race and mid-race, you see the jockey fall off. You don't say, well, that's a minor setback. You say, the probability of winning just went to zero.
Exactly.
And Novin is saying we've had 3 jockeys fall off simultaneously this week.
That's a very vivid way to put it, but yeah. We are dealing with 3 specific simultaneous shocks: constitutional, trade, and geopolitical. And the core of Novin's argument here is that these aren't isolated events, they're interacting variables.
They feed into each other.
Precisely. The constitutional chaos makes the trade shock worse, which in turn makes the geopolitical isolation more dangerous.
So our mission for this deep dive is to unpack these 3 shocks, which honestly are pretty wild just on their own,
Yeah.
and then use that Bayesian framework to look at the 5 potential future scenarios Novin lays out for the UK through 2031.
Let's do it.
And we have to start with the constitutional shock, because that's the one dominating every single front page right now.
The Mandelson arrest.
The arrest, Monday morning, 2 a.m., February 23rd.
Huh.
Lord Peter Mandelson taken into custody by the Met Police.
On suspicion of misconduct in public office, and we need to be very precise here, because the rumor mill is in absolute overdrive. Novin's report outlines that this isn't just a rehash of his association with Jeffrey Epstein from a purely social perspective.
Right. It's a very specific allegation.
Yes, the allegation is that back in 2010, while serving in government, Mandelson provided Epstein with advance knowledge of a €500 billion bank bailout.
And that's the key differentiator. That's market-sensitive government information. If that turns out to be true, it moves the dial from bad judgment to an active criminal conspiracy.
Exactly. And for Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer, this isn't just an embarrassing headline about a colleague. It's a massive institutional crisis.
Because it completely decapitates his diplomatic strategy. I mean, remember, Starmer burned a lot of political capital, appointing Mandelson as ambassador to the U.S. back in December 2024.
He did. He framed it as the return of the grown-ups to the room.
Right. And he reportedly ignored intelligence warnings to do it. Then he had to dismiss him by September 2025. But the stain is still there.
And now, if you look at the operational capacity section of Novin's report, it paints a picture of a completely hollowed-out Downing Street. I mean, Starmer's chief of staff, Morgan McSweeney, resigned on February 8th.
And his communications director, Tim Allen, walked out the very next day, February 9th.
Right. So apply that Bayesian lens here. Your prior assumption might have been that the Labour government is struggling, but, secure until the next election. Then you feed in this new data, no chief of staff, a criminal scandal involving the PM's mentor, and a prime minister who looks totally isolated.
The probability of the government collapsing before the term ends just spikes dramatically.
It does. And Novin highlights a specific signal event that you really need to watch out for: the Gorton and Denton by-election.
Yeah, the stress test. Historically, Gorton and Denton is a Labour fortress.
Yeah.
But Novin's data shows Reform UK is actually polling really efficiently there right now.
If Labour loses a safe seat in the middle of a massive corruption scandal,
Then the signal becomes noise. It tells the markets and the party backbenchers that the leadership is basically terminal.
Precisely. It creates a feedback loop. Weakness invites challenges, which just creates more weakness. And this internal paralysis is happening at the exact moment the UK needs strong leadership to deal with shock number two.
The trade whipsaw. Honestly, reading this section of the report gave me legitimate anxiety. It felt like watching a car crash in slow motion.
It's the perfect example of a false dawn.
So take us back to last Friday, February 20th. We got the news from the U.S. Supreme Court in Learning Resources, Inc. versus Trump. They ruled that the president could not use the IEPA Act to impose tariffs.
And London cheered. I mean, the FTSE rallied. The assumption across the board was, okay, the legal basis for Trump's tariffs is gone. We are back to free trade.
But that joy lasted, what, 6 hours?
Less than that. Within hours, President Trump invoked a completely different statute, Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974.
I dug into Section 122 a bit for this. It's nasty stuff. It allows for a global surcharge to fix a balance of payments deficit. And it's much, much harder to challenge in court than the Emergency Powers Act.
And Trump didn't hesitate. He slapped on a replacement 10% global surcharge immediately. And then, because stability is apparently overrated, he went on Truth Social and signaled it's going up to 15%.
But here's the kicker, and this is what creates the horizon problem that Novin talks about. Section 122 authority has a shelf life. It expires in exactly 150 days.
July 24th, 2026. You really need to put that date in your calendar.
So if you are a UK business owner, say you export precision parts to Detroit, you are in hell right now. You don't know if the tariff is 10%, 15%, or 0% come July.
How do you price your goods? How do you sign a supply contract?
You don't. You freeze.
Exactly. That is the horizon problem. Investment stops because the risk parameters are undefined. And this is exactly where the shocks interact with each other. Because normally, what do? You send your charming, high-profile ambassador to Washington to negotiate an exemption before that 150-day clock runs out.
But we don't have an ambassador because he was just arrested at 2 in the morning.
Exactly. The UK is currently in a congested queue with 18 other trading partners, all trying to cut a deal with a highly transactional U.S. administration. And we have an empty chair in Washington. We are negotiating with a terrifyingly weak hand.
It really underscores this concept of agency that the report brings up. We are subject to these massive forces, but we lack the basic tools to influence them. Which brings us to shock 3. Because you'd think if the U.S. is squeezing us, surely our old friends in Europe are cutting us some slack.
You would hope so. But Novin argues this is where the geopolitical marginalization becomes undeniable. And the smoking gun here is the failure of the SAFE negotiations.
SAFE the security action for Europe. This is the EU's new 150 billion euro defense instrument. We want it in. We had the biggest defense industry in Europe, so it seems like a slam dunk.
But the negotiations collapsed in November 2025. And the why is just devastating. It wasn't about technical standards or interoperability. It was about the entry fee.
The pay-to-play cost. The report states the EU demanded the UK pay 6 billion euros to join.
A huge sum. But you have to look at the comparative data point Novin provides. Canada was admitted to the exact same program.
For 10 million euros.
10 million, that ratio, 6 billion versus 10 million, that is the whole story. Novin interprets this not as a financial calculation by Brussels, but as a purely political one.
It's a symbolic downgrading.
Right. They are signaling Canada is a partner, the UK is a competitor and a third country. If you want back in, you pay the Brexit penalty. It's not on preferential terms anymore.
And because we refused, or just couldn't afford, that 6 billion, our defense firms, companies like BAE Systems and Rolls-Royce, are now capped at 33% participation in EU contracts.
Which is a disaster during an active war. We have the Russia-Ukraine conflict still grinding on. Defense supply chains need to be completely integrated. Instead, British firms are being artificially walled off.
Right.
And just to twist the knife, while we are alienated from the U.S. and the EU, China is quietly pulling the rug out from under us on raw materials.
The China factor.
Yeah.
Beijing has reduced exports of yttrium and scandium by 95%.
These are basically the vitamins of modern industry. You need them for radar systems, for guidance chips, for advanced aerospace alloys.
And telecommunications.
Exactly. Beijing knows the UK is vulnerable right now, so they are squeezing the supply chain. We can't easily decouple from China because we desperately need the materials, but we obviously can't align with them politically. It's a strategic trap.
So Let's pause and just look at the board for a second. We have a government paralyzed by a criminal scandal. We have a trade war with the U.S. on a ticking 150-day clock. We have been priced out of European defense integration, and we're running out of rare earth metals.
And we have absolutely no economic buffer to absorb any of it.
That's segment 4 of the report, the anemic economic backdrop. Because usually, when a shock like this hits, a government will just spend its way out of trouble. Stimulus checks, tax cuts, industry subsidies.
Right, counter-cyclical spending, but you can't do that when your economy is already flatlining. Look at the data Novin pulls for Q4 2025. Real GDP growth was 0.1%.
Which is basically statistical noise away from a recession. And unemployment is ticking up to 5.2%.
But the stat that really hurts, the one people actually feel, is household disposable income. The projection for 2026 is just 0.25% growth.
Down from 3% previously.
That means people are getting poorer in real terms. And here is the mechanism that Novin explains so well crowding out. The government needs to spend money on defense. We are trying to hit that 2.5 to 2.6% of GDP target.
And we're sending £3 billion a year to Ukraine in aid.
But because economic growth is essentially zero, tax revenue is flat. So to fund that critical defense spending, the government has to either borrow heavily or cut elsewhere.
And that borrowing sucks up all the available capital in the market, driving up interest rates for private businesses.
Exactly. Or it forces massive cuts to public services. So you get this vicious cycle. The private sector can't invest because capital is too expensive, and the public sector is cutting services just to buy ammunition.
It leaves the average citizen with higher mortgages, worse public services, and absolutely no wage growth.
It's a very bleak picture.
It is. But this is the deep dive, and we don't just stop at, well, everything is broken. We want to know where this actually goes. And this is where Novin's Bayesian game theory gets really interesting. He maps out 5 potential scenarios for the UK through 2031 based on how these shocks play out.
And remember, these are probabilities. They aren't set in stone. They change dynamically based on what happens with the Mandelson scandal or the Section 122 deadline.
Let's start with scenario 1. Novin actually gives this the highest probability at 30%. He calls it Fortress Europe integration.
This is essentially the Norway Plus outcome. And it's fascinating because it predicts a massive political U-turn. Novin argues that if the U.S. tariffs persist past that July deadline, the U.K. will essentially have no choice. A successor government, assuming Starmer falls, will have to pivot back to Europe.
But politically, that seems toxic. I mean, how do you sell rejoining the single market to a country that went through the whole Brexit process?
Well, you don't call it rejoining. You frame it entirely as a defense necessity. You go to the public and say, look, we are locked out of safe. We literally can't get the parts for our defense systems. We need to integrate our supply chains to keep the nation secure.
Novin calls this the khaki washing of EU reentry.
Exactly. You wrap the economic reality in national security. It makes the political pill much easier to swallow.
So we become a rule taker from Brussels again, but we claim it's to defend the realm. Okay, scenario 2. He gives us a 25% probability. Transactional Atlanticism.
This is the scenario where Starmer somehow survives the current chaos. He looks at that July 24th deadline for the U.S. tariffs. He panics and he blinks. He rushes a quick, dirty deal with Trump.
And because we have no leverage and no ambassador, that deal is going to be incredibly painful.
It would be brutal. To get that tariff exemption, the U.S. would almost certainly demand full access to UK healthcare and agriculture. We're talking about chlorinated chicken, hormone-treated beef, and letting U.S. pharma companies bid freely on NHS contracts.
That would spark riots, surely.
It would be hugely unpopular domestically, and geopolitically, it would alienate the EU permanently. We would essentially be pivoting entirely into the U.S. regulatory orbit. We'd be an economic satellite of the U.S., but without a vote in Congress.
Moving on to scenario 3. Also at 25% probability, sick man stagnation.
This is the inertia scenario. Total paralysis. The government is too weak from the scandals to pivot to the U.S. or the EU. They can't pass meaningful legislation. The Mandelson investigations drag on for months. We miss the July tariff deadline entirely.
So we get hit with the permanent tariffs, and we stay locked out of the EU Defense Pact.
Yes, we just drift. The economy hovers at 1% growth or lower. Strategic incoherence means foreign investment dries up entirely because nobody knows what the UK's actual strategy is. We basically become the sick man of Europe again, just slowly declining while all our neighbors grow.
That feels like the boiled frog scenario.
Okay.
Now, scenario 4 is the one that genuinely scared me. 15% probability. Defense first, autarky.
This is the emergency war footing. It assumes the geopolitical situation externally gets much worse. Maybe the use of tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine or a direct NATO escalation with Russia.
And autarky basically means self-sufficiency, right? Closing the doors.
In this context, it means the entire UK economy is forcefully repurposed for national survival. Civilian services are slashed to the bone to fund the military. We stop caring about international trade deals and start caring about rationing and stockpiling food and fuel. It's a very grim Fortress Island mentality.
15% seems really high for something that extreme.
It is high,
Yeah.
but Novin's model adds probability points here specifically because of the fragility we discussed earlier. If the global trade system breaks down because of shock 2 and the supply chains snap because of shock 3, the UK might be forced into autarky whether it wants it or not.
Wow. Okay, and finally, scenario 5, which sounds like the dream of 2016, global Britain wildcard. But he only gives it a 5% probability.
Right. This is the idea that the UK successfully builds a totally new trade architecture, independent of both the US and the EU, perhaps anchored by the CPTPP out in the Pacific.
Why is it only 5%?
Because of the agency problem we keep coming back to. To pull something like that off, you need massive diplomatic capital, a booming economy to offer as a prize to partners, and a completely unified, visionary government. The UK currently has none of those things. I mean, you can't build a new global world order when you can't even appoint an ambassador to your closest ally.
That word agency, it really is the thread tying this entire report together. We are heading into the G7 summit in Evian-les-Bains very shortly, and the UK will be there. We'll be in the family photos.
But Novin's closing argument is pretty brutal. He distinguishes between status and agency. Status is having a seat at the table. Agency is having the actual power to decide what's on the menu.
And right now, we are looking at the menu and realizing we can't afford any of the entrees.
The next few months are absolutely critical. The UK must resolve the US tariff issue before July 24th, and it has to find a viable way to plug back into European security structures. If we fail at those two specific tasks, the Bayesian probabilities shift decisively away from integration and heavily towards stagnation, or worse.
It's not a question of whether the UK survives. Countries always survive in some form. It's about what kind of country we are in 2031. Are we going to be a rule maker or a rule taker in this new order?
That is the defining question, and looking at the convergence of fragility Novin describes, the answer is uncomfortably up in the air.
You know, it makes you wonder, if national agency is fracturing this badly, maybe the next era isn't about mid-sized powers at all. Maybe we'll see cities or giant tech corporations having to step up and handle their own subnational diplomacy just to keep supply chains alive.
That's a whole other deep dive right there.
It really is. We'll be watching that Gorton-Denton by-election like hawks, that's for sure, and counting down the days to July 24th.
It's going to be a very long summer.
Thanks for diving deep with us. Keep an eye on the horizon, and we'll catch you next time.